Weekenders, Mrs. Croft here again. Today, I want to review a little bit about what we learned in our last story. We talked about deciduous trees, and we talked about a little bit about evergreen trees. So that is what we're going to talk about today. Can you find the evergreen trees in this picture? Yep, those are the ones that look kind of like a Christmas tree. So let's get on with our vocabulary and our story while we're looking at these evergreen trees. Our vocabulary today includes the word cones. Now, we talked about cones as things that we can put in the road, an ice cream cone, those types of things. But the cones on these trees are the cones that hold the seeds. So it's the part of the evergreen tree that has the seeds. So here's an example. Evan picked up the cones from underneath the evergreen tree. Conifers. Ooh, that's a neat word. Conifers. Evergreen trees that have needle-like leaves and make cones. Example. Luciana tried not to prick her finger on the sharp needles of the conifers. Some conifer trees are pokey, but look at the conifer trees in this picture. All these pine trees or conifers have cones, and they drop those cones so that they can reseed into the ground. Evergreen. We talked a little bit about this word before. It means having green leaves all year round. The evergreen tree looked green in the winter. Needles. Now, there's two kinds of needles. We have needles that we sew with, which are kind of pointy and they're sharp, and needles on the conifer trees, which are very thin leaves. If you look at a conifer tree, yes, those little pine needles are leaves. And some of them are very prickly, but some of them are very soft. So let's review. What are the two main types of trees? Evergreen and deciduous. That is correct. How are they different? Well, the deciduous trees we learned last time, they lose their their leaves in the fall. Evergreen trees stay green all year. What happens to the leaves of the deciduous tree in the fall or the autumn? You were right. The leaves of the deciduous trees are all shed off in autumn, or they fall. Why do deciduous trees lose their leaves in the fall? If you remember, it's because there's not much light during the winter months, and so this plant stops making leaves and it tries to conserve energy during the winter. When do deciduous trees begin to grow new leaves? Think of those seasons we talked about. You're right, they start growing back in the spring, and we call that springtime, and that's kind of how we know. Now, thumbs up or thumbs down, tell me. Evergreen trees lose their leaves in the fall. Thumbs down, yes. Deciduous trees lose their leaves in the fall. Thumbs up. Here, let's get on with our story today. I want you to listen to the main topic or the idea of today's lesson. Listen carefully to learn about the evergreen trees and to find out how they're different from deciduous trees, besides just how they look. The trees in this picture are all evergreen trees. Evergreen trees are similar and different to deciduous trees that you learned about in our last story. We use the word evergreen to describe plants that have leaves and stay green all year round. Evergreens come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but they all have at least one obvious thing in common. They're always green. Do you remember what word is inside the word evergreen that helps us to remember? Ever. That's right. Are there any evergreen trees like this near your home? Check around and see if you can see any. One type of evergreen tree is called a pine tree. Pine trees have a pleasant smell, which many people like to have in their homes during the winter months, during Christmas time. Here is some pine needles. Remember we talked about needles, and you can see that they're kind of pointy on the ends, so they might be a little bit sharp. These leaves of most evergreen trees are called needles, and the needles are very thin leaves. This picture shows the needles of a pine tree. Evergreen trees, like deciduous trees, make food through photosynthesis. Remember, that's how plants get energy from the sun, and which occurs in these tiny little leaves. Do you remember what photosynthesis is? Yep, it's how plants do that. They turn that water and air into food, and that's how they get energy from the sun. Photosynthesis slows down during the winter in the evergreen trees, but it doesn't stop altogether as it does in deciduous trees, because the needles of an evergreen tree are much smaller than the leaves of a deciduous tree. It is easier for the evergreen to make enough food to keep most of its leaves alive and on the tree all year. So, wherever you find evergreen trees, you will also likely find these things scattered all over the ground. What are these? You're right, they're cones, they're pine cones. And if you look up while you're standing under an evergreen tree, you might see some of these growing on trees' branches. They're called cones. Cones are the parts of some evergreen trees that contain the seeds. Most evergreen trees are called conifers, which is another word for trees that have needle-like leaves and make cones. That word, conifer. The cones in this picture are called pine cones. Unlike deciduous trees, which have flowers and fruit, conifers do not have flowers and they do not grow fruit. Instead, conifer trees make cones. That would be its flower, and the seeds grow inside the cones. When a cone opens up on the ground, the seeds fall out and they're spread by the wind. Why are these seeds so important? You're right, they help make the tree grow new trees. If a seed falls into the soil and has the right amount of food and water and air and light, it might grow into a seedling and then a sapling. And then do you know what happens after that? Yep, that baby tree called a sapling is going to grow into a young tree. The first plants you will notice in this picture are ferns, which are not evergreens or trees. Ferns are short little plants that grow in the woods. If you have sharp eyes, though, you might just see another plant inside this picture. Can you see it? Yep, there's a little pine sapling or a baby tree pushing its way through these ferns. Right here. Did you see that sapling right there? If you didn't, that's okay. It is hard to see. If the sapling is tough, and many pine trees are, it's going to continue to grow until it stands high above the ferns. It may grow big enough to produce its own pine cones one day. Remember that seeds to make pine trees come from cones. Now let's look at another part of the tree. Wow, this looks like a tree's skin, which it kind of is. A tree adds a new layer of wood each year. This new layer forms in what's called a growth ring. When you cut down a tree, you can see these growth rings, and you can tell exactly how old a tree is by the rings. So if we counted all these rings in here, we would know how old this tree is. Now, some of you may wonder what this part is in our tree. Well, that's probably when it was a small sapling, there was a branch there, and it may have been broken off. So it left a little mark there, because that's what happens on some of them. And then there are some other scratch marks and stuff, probably from when they cut this tree. How old do you think this tree is? This tree is a little more than 50 years old, which is actually pretty young for a tree. If it hadn't been cut down, this tree may have lived to be 100 or more and have 100 or more growth rings. Each one of these little pieces around here is a ring. So if we were to count them, we might go 1, let's start in the middle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We could be counting a long time. but there is more than 50. Remember, evergreen trees and deciduous trees are the two main types of trees found in the world. Next time you see a tree, try to figure out whether it is an evergreen or a deciduous tree. The leaves will give you your first clue. Remember, evergreen trees have needles and deciduous trees have leaves. Deciduous tree or evergreen tree? If this is a deciduous tree, I want you to raise your hands high in the air and spread your fingers out like leaves. If it's a pine tree or an evergreen tree, I want you to bring your hands by your ears and close your fingers up tight. Here we go. This tree has broad leaves. I put my hands way up in the air and spread my fingers. Yes, it's a deciduous tree. This tree has thin needles. Okay, I brought my hands in down kind of by my ears and pulled my fingers in tight. And this tree doesn't fall off in the fall. The leaves on this tree doesn't fall off in the fall. Yes, again, you probably brought your fingers in and closed your fingers in tight. It's an evergreen. This tree, its leaves fall off in the fall. Yep, if you put your hands in the air and spread your fingers apart, you were imitating a deciduous tree, and you were right. Let's check your comprehension, or if you understood what we were reading today. What is an evergreen tree? An evergreen tree is a tree that stays green year-round. That is right. What important part of a plant is found in the cones? What important part of that plant is in the cones? If you said seeds, you're correct, because that's the beginning of all plants. What are the leaves of an evergreen tree called? Needles. A lot of people just say pine needles, but just let's call them needles of an evergreen tree. They're important because that's how the evergreen tree makes its photosynthesis and feeds itself. How can you tell how old a tree is? Remember that picture? Yep, we can count the rings, the growth rings inside the tree. But here's a question. How do we count how old the tree is if we don't cut it down? We can't count its growth rings unless we cut it down. Interesting question. Something that we need to think about. Now, let's do some word work. In the read aloud, you heard evergreen trees are similar and different to deciduous trees you learned about. Say the word deciduous. Deciduous. Now say the word evergreen. Evergreen. If a plant is deciduous, it loses all of its leaves in the fall. If a plant is an evergreen, it keeps some green leaves or needles all year long. We can look at most trees and identify them as deciduous or evergreen. So, have you ever seen deciduous trees or evergreen trees? Talk to someone about it. Walk around your yard or walk around in your area and see if you can identify whether these trees are deciduous or evergreen. In the wintertime, it's pretty easy. What's this word we've been talking about? Evergreen and deciduous. Both those words. All right, let's make some choices. I'm going to read a sentence. If the sentence I read describes a deciduous tree, say the sentence describes a deciduous tree. If the sentence I read describes an evergreen tree, say the sentence describes an evergreen tree. Remember, we're trying to use complete sentences. Here's your first one. The trees in the forest are beautiful in the autumn with their red and yellow leaves. This sentence describes a deciduous tree. Yes, that is right. The ground is covered with pine cones that have fallen from the tree. Remember to use a complete sentence. This sentence describes an evergreen tree. In the winter, the branches of this tree are bare. Yes, this sentence describes a deciduous tree. The trees in our backyard stay green all year long. Yes, this sentence describes an evergreen tree. Now make sure you're saying a complete sentence when we answer these. The tree makes its food in the thin leaves called needles. That's a clue. This sentence describes an evergreen tree. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you learned a lot about evergreens and deciduous trees again.